It was a day of infamy for the Russian government and terror for millions of Ukrainians. Vladimir Putin wrote himself into the history books in all the wrong ways as he invaded a democratic, sovereign neighbor in a war of imperial conquest with chilling echoes of the 1930s. The Russians are tonight said to be in control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Its condition and that of the nuclear waste stored there are unknown. Western leaders have been briefed to expect a surgical strike into Kiev, perhaps tonight or tomorrow. We will try to assess what is happening and what it might mean for all of us. James has been tracking a day of military advances on all fronts. The Russians appear to have taken an airport outside the capital as they prepare to close in. Dan reports from eastern Ukraine, where the Russians are tonight said to be approaching the key strategic city of Dnipro.
I don't have place to go, so I will stay home and wait.
And Rohit has witnessed a day of growing fear and panic in Kiev as many have tried to flee west. A short time ago, Joe Biden announced a new package of sanctions coordinated with Western allies.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Here, the Prime Minister warned the Russian president could not be allowed to succeed.
This hideous and barbarous venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, as some protesters risked jail by taking to the streets, the Russian president himself appeared to threaten the West with a nuclear strike if it intervened. In China, they were once again breaching Taiwanese airspace. Debbie will assess what their reaction to the events in Ukraine might be. And back here, as millions wrestle with the economic implications of today's events, those with loved ones in Ukraine could only watch and wait.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Before dawn this morning, Vladimir Putin launched an all-out war of conquest against his sovereign democratic neighbour, Ukraine. It is the first time the subjugation and suppression of such a large, hostile population has been attempted since the events that led up to the Second World War. It is by no means certain the Russians will ultimately succeed. The Prime Minister insisted they must not. He has been briefed to expect a strike into Kiev very soon, perhaps tonight or tomorrow, to try and topple the government there. It is unclear tonight whether Ukraine's leaders have responded by taking evasive action. Certainly, there has been evidence of Russian troops around the capital today. What is not in doubt is that Russian missiles have damaged, if not destroyed, airports, air bases and other military targets all across the country. Armoured columns and ground troops crossed the border from the north, from the east and the south, while Western countries were given a chilling warning by President Putin, who even hinted at the possibility of a nuclear strike. Try to stop us, he said, and you will face the worst ever reprisals. There is much ground to cover tonight as we try to assess the state of play. But first, James is in Kiev to give us an overview of what we have seen on this, the day war, long feared and foreshadowed, returned to the heart of Europe.
US intelligence had warned Putin was planning exactly this, but how many really believed it? That a full-scale armoured and air assault against a European country was remotely possible. The early hours of this morning and the ugly clatter of Russian helicopter gunships swept away any such illusions. A military airbase just 20 miles or so from the capital, Kiev, under assault by airborne troops. In the skies above the city, 2 Ukrainian fighter jets raced towards the battle. There are few details of the fighting. At least one Russian helicopter is known to have been shot down. And at mid-afternoon today, Russian airborne troops were filmed apparently in control of the airbase.
They are Russian airborne forces.
Now confirmed by the Ukrainian government. It may be a dangerous bridgehead for an assault on central Kiev. Russian attacks have stretched west almost to the Polish border. An airbase near Lviv hit by this cruise missile. Among more than 100 missiles launched last night, a precision strike appears to have taken out a radar station near the Black Sea coast in the south of the country. On three main axes from the north, the northeast and the south, here from Crimea, armoured vehicles and their support convoys were filmed driving through border posts, all marked with a white painted Z for recognition. Invincible as these columns may first appear, it's clear the Ukrainian defenders have had at least some success. Pictures of shattered armour appearing throughout today. Ukraine's president spoke to his nation this evening.
What we're hearing today, it's the sound of a new Iron Curtain descending, cutting Russia off from the civilized world. It is our task as a nation to make sure that this Iron Curtain doesn't pass through our Ukrainian territory.
This afternoon, Putin was addressing an assembled gathering of the wealthiest oligarchs in Russia, men likely to soon feel the full force of sanctions. Last night, as he announced the attack, he had thought nothing of hinting at nuclear war.
Whoever tries to impede us, let alone create threats for our country and its people, must know that the Russian response will be immediate and lead to the consequences you have never seen in history.
As he spoke, the UN Security Council had been in session. The Ukrainian ambassador didn't mince words to his Russian counterpart.
There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
Across Europe, leaders had been woken to hear that once again, war has been unleashed on their continent.
Ukraine is a country that for decades has enjoyed freedom and democracy and the right to choose its own destiny. We and the world cannot allow that freedom just to be snuffed out.
From Washington, a significant push to Europeans wondering how hard to go with sanctions.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy.
NATO is meeting in special session. Even non-members, Sweden and Finland, are to attend. More than 100 aircraft are on high alert.
This is a grave moment for the security of Europe. This is a deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion.
On Ukraine's western borders, thousands are already queuing to leave the country. The horrors of war are frequently followed by a refugee crisis. This may be no exception. Before today ended, pictures emerged of Russian armour surrounding the Chernobyl power station. Almost unbelievably, there had been a firefight for control of it. But these are the sort of risks that we are exposed to when an unthinkable war suddenly becomes a real shooting war. James Mason, News at 10, Kiev.
Russian airspace was closed.
Take stock now of what we do know of the events of the past 18 hours or so. The invasion started in the early hours of the morning. Before dawn, missile strikes and shelling could be heard in several cities, including Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipro, where, as we'll see, our correspondent Dan Rivers has been today, and Odessa. As day broke, Russian military vehicles were seen entering Ukraine at various points along the border, including from Russian-held Crimea and from Belarus to the north, Russia's ally. Airports and air bases have also been targeting, prompting Ukrainian airspace to be closed. And Russian forces appear, as James was saying just there, to have seized the Chernobyl nuclear plant, site of the world's worst nuclear disaster. So let's rewind slightly back to Dnipro and Dan's report from a city under attack.
It was an apocalyptic start to a day no one in Ukraine will ever forget or forgive. This was Dnipro before first light, an ammunition dump hit by a Russian airstrike. The sunrise revealing a country under attack from its neighbour. The bombardment was vicious and unrelenting. Some came so close to death it was scarcely believable. This living room in Kharkiv was lanced by a missile that somehow didn't detonate. In the city's main square, they were praying for more miracles. Some, though, were not spared. President Putin claims these were precision strikes. If so, it appears Ukraine's people are his enemy. We drove across a large swathe of the east of the country today as the missiles fell, taking out military targets, but there were plenty of shells falling on civilians too. Russia's Grad missile system is well known from 8 years of war here, and it's feared with good reason. The scramble for cash, a sign of the rising alarm. The queue for fuel, a sign of the growing shortages. How are you feeling?
Shaking, but I don't know. Oh, when you start to ask me, I start to worry. I don't have place to go, so I will stay home and wait what will be.
The Russian forces moving north from Crimea appear to be making rapid progress following the Dnieper River, but at some point they're going to arrive here, a city of more than 1 million people. The Russians may still be a few hundred miles downstream from Dnipro, but people here are making the most of these last hours together. Outside the city's main administrative building, soldiers eye everyone nervously, but these men are signing up to defend their country.
This isn't just a war between Ukraine and Russia, but between Russia, Europe and the rest of the world.
Dnipro is strategically critical, straddling the river which bisects this country. If the Russians want all of Ukraine, they'll have to take this city eventually. Dan Rivers, News at 10, Dnipro.
There had been warnings for weeks that this was coming, but when the warning sirens sounded at dawn this morning, there was some uncertainty amongst the people of Kiev about how to react. Many had been anticipating a Russian invasion of the rebel republics in the east. They weren't expecting Russian airstrikes across Ukraine. As they began, Ukraine's President Zelensky told his people not to panic. In some places, yes, calm did persist, but in others, fear quickly spread as people rushed to withdraw their money, pack up and get out.
By 5 a.m, the attack on the capital was underway. The warnings they'd been told to ignore were right after all. Sunrise and sirens. The Russian military were getting closer. Neighbours became friends. Here they turned an art gallery into a makeshift bunker.
Everybody is scared, but we try to keep calm.
Yeah, you can hear it now. The missiles sent to demolish buildings had emboldened people.
We are angry. We are angry.
We are very angry.
Yes.
I'm very angry.
But we have.
I'm not scared. I'm angry.
Then came the jets. Ukrainian armored vehicles. Suddenly, people realized their neighborhood was now a war zone. Time to collect what money they could.
So scary, very scary. I'm sorry. Sorry.
And leave. At the train station, a long line of lives torn apart. Unexpected journeys begin. Uncertainty is ahead. They have wiped the arrivals board here. There is no need for it because the traffic is all going in one direction. Everyone here is just trying to get out of the city. Then there are those who stayed behind in the unchanging city to face a fate which has yet to be imposed. Rohit Katru, News at 10, Kiev.
Well, we'll speak to Rohit in Kiev in just a moment. But first, let's go back to Dan in Dnipro in eastern Ukraine. Dan, what is the situation with you there tonight?
Well, I think the sort of profound emotion from the people we've been talking to is one of shock, really. People just cannot believe that this has happened, even though they've had weeks of warnings by Western intelligence agencies. Finally, this terrible day has unfolded and unfolded in really horrific way, as you saw in our reports there. I think there are several things now going forward as to what will happen next. There's lots of talk about possible militias springing up to complicate this situation even further. Apparently, Russia had been wargaming for some time which local politicians it could co-opt over to its side and perhaps bribe to sort of head up local militias. So that's one dynamic. Of course, you've got power vacuums in a lot of places where the Ukrainians and Russians are fighting each other, but there's no one actually in charge of law and order. There are a couple of other interesting little details, though, Tom. One is that the total death toll by the Russians today is 350. The Ukrainians say they only lost about 50, so that's a kill rate of 7 to 1.
OK, Dan, for now, look after yourself. Speak tomorrow, but thank you very much. So let's go to Rohit in Kiev. Look, Rohit, we hear that Western leaders have been briefed to expect a possible strike into Kiev to try and topple the government. What are you hearing?
Well, Tom, I can tell you on and off throughout the evening, we've heard this sort of haunting sound of low-flying jets, the distant thud of explosions on the horizon. And what's happening here in Kiev is only part of it. We're learning from the UK government this evening that they believe that 100 missiles have been fired, 75 aircraft used by the Russians, 13 sites targeted as well. And yet the vast majority of their troops are still on standby. They have a lot in reserve. And the feeling is that they will now be advancing from Belarus here towards Kiev, towards this city, towards the capital. And crucial to that operation is what's going on a few miles away at that airfield that James reported on, which has been under the control of, there's been a fierce battle there today, under the control of the Ukrainians and by the Russians at different times. It's considered to be crucial to the Russians because that's where they want to land many more of their troops to eventually surround this city, it's believed, and from there to actually launch this decapitation exercise against this government.
OK, Rohit, same to you. Please look after yourself. But for now, thank you. Now, the extended sanctions against Russia announced by the Prime Minister this afternoon will, he says, hobble the Russian economy. More than 100 businesses and individuals linked to the Putin regime, including the president's former son-in-law, will feel the squeeze. Aeroflot, the Russian airline, will be banned. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, called for the hardest possible sanctions, which he said should include cutting Russia out of the international banking system known as SWIFT.
Sanctions now! Sanctions now! Sanctions now!
Distressed Ukrainians in Britain, opposite Downing Street, urging the Prime Minister to financially punish Putin and Russia for the invasion. And in a meeting of the Emergency Cobra Committee at 7:30 this morning, that was on the mind of senior ministers, as the Prime Minister made clear at noon.
Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy.
And shortly after that, the Russian ambassador drove to see the Foreign Secretary for a dressing down. And then
Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands. Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest.
So he said he'd punish him economically. The Prime Minister's new 10-point package of sanctions includes a freeze on the assets of 100 super-rich oligarchs and military businesses, a freeze on the assets of more banks, including the second biggest VTB, a ban on the sale to Russia of high-tech equipment and kit useful to their oil and gas industry, a ban on the sale of dual-use equipment that could have military uses, a prohibition on Aeroflot flying here, and measures to make it harder for companies in the Russian state to raise money in the UK. Although the Ukrainian government was disappointed Russia hasn't been expelled from the SWIFT international payment system, this wasn't a moment for political point scoring.
We must urgently reinforce and reassure our NATO allies in Eastern Europe, who now stand at the frontier of Putin's aggression.
A former Prime Minister wants Putin punished so that
Russia feels absolutely the cold wind of isolation, and the Russian people understand that Vladimir Putin has brought their state to a pariah state.
May I ask him, however, to look wider than simply the Russian people and to look at all those who are enabling Putin's economy and to update the Treason Act so that we can identify them and call them what they are, traitors.
they've had a long vigil for their friends, for their families left behind. While our ministers meeting again tonight in emergency session with Downing Street lit up in Ukraine's colours, know all our destinies are in the balance. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, we'll speak to Robert in a moment, but first let's go to Emma outside the White House. Big moment in a way for President Biden tonight. What did you make of what you heard?
Well, he was definitely attempting to make it clear to the world that he has put in place those sanctions that he has been threatening for days, the mother of all sanctions packages, as it's been dubbed. And there's no doubt it does go a lot further than the sanctions that he announced just a couple of days ago. It targets Russia's big banks. It targets Russia's big companies. It basically means that $1 trillion of assets that are in the US will not be able to be accessed. And there are also export restrictions. That means that certain high-tech exports will not be allowed. It's likely that they will have an effect on the way that the military can be developed in Russia, or at least that is the great hope. Now, there's no doubt that President Biden has a belief that President Putin's assets are squirreled away in democracies like this, those democracies he seeks to decry. And so he wants to try and hit him in his pocket, but he has not gone as far yet as to sanction Putin personally. If you take a look behind me, there is a gathering now outside the White House. Ukrainians and Russians standing together. They are pleading with America to show support. They know that in the past, America has a strategic impatience and has abandoned countries that it has promised to support. They are pleading tonight not to do that to Ukraine.
OK, Emma, thank you very much indeed. Well, as I said, we're going to bring all that to Robert. Look, the mother of all sanctions, Emma was saying there, you've spent most of your adult life writing and talking about the national and the international economy. So I think a lot of people will have a question tonight. What is the true economic impact of this on Russia? And equally, what could they have done they didn't do?
So these are not the mother of all sanctions, and they'll take quite a long time to have a significant effect. It's difficult for the Russians to, when you freeze the assets of banks and you say you can't raise money in that international markets, it makes it more difficult for them to finance their operations. But there are alternatives. They can tilt east towards China to do that, and over time this ban on sales, for example, of military equipment or equipment for their extractive, that's their oil and gas industries, over time that again will cause them problems, but not overnight. Putin can live with this. What the West has so far failed to do is significantly reduce its purchases of the most valuable asset that Russia has, which is oil and gas. And the reason for that is because the Italian and German economies in particular are utterly dependent on that gas. The lights would go off if they said we're going to stop buying that stuff. And secondly, there is this issue of why Russia has not been expelled from the SWIFT message system, which allows banks to transfer money. And that is because, again, lots of European businesses and indeed global businesses outside of Russia would be damaged by that. And again, they're worried that all that will happen is that Russia will go to China for those services.
OK, to be continued for now, though, Robert. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in Russia itself, people relying solely on state television coverage for what's going on will have seen only Russian attacks in the disputed regions of eastern Ukraine. Many know nothing of the widespread air campaign, which is how the Russian president wants it, of course. This is Putin's war, not the people's. Those who dare to protest against it are thrown into police vans.
Russian state TV coverage of Ukraine today concentrated on the Donbass in the east of the country. Viewers aren't seeing the enormity of what's happening across the whole of Ukraine as the Kremlin presents its version of this invasion. One of Russia's leading independent journalists told me he's in disbelief.
I'm in deep shock. I can't believe my eyes. I can't believe my ears, and it's a tragic, really tragic moment for Ukraine, for Russia as well. Russia, from the view of the whole world, is turning into a pariah state like Iran or North Korea.
As the effect of sanctions batters Russia's currency, on the streets they're taking stock of President Putin's decision. I think if this is in the interests of Russia, then I support it, this man says.
I think that not all people suppose with Putin, but I don't know. But no, I think that it's a very bad situation and I want to cry. No.
Mr. Prime Minister. It seemed like business as usual for the man who's trying to force a new world order. President Putin meeting Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan.
President Putin's plans for invading Ukraine would have factored in sanctions and international condemnation. But the unknown in all of this is whether the strength of the world's response will have any impact. It seems very unlikely.
No to war, they shouted in Moscow tonight and in other cities across Russia. But the police were waiting for them. One spoke of her anger.
I don't agree with what Putin's doing. It's awful. It's immoral. How can you behave like this?
Gestapo, they cried, as the arrests started. Neil Connery, News at 10, Moscow.
A lot of brave people in Ukraine, but also, as we can see there, in Moscow. Now, the only world power not to condemn Russia's attacks on Ukraine was, yes, you guessed it, China. It has expansionist ideas of its own, of course. Taiwan is in its sights, and Robert was referring to China being critical only a few moments ago. So let's go and talk to Debbie, who's in the Chinese capital. Debbie, what approach has Beijing taken so far?
Well, Tom, not only has China refused to condemn Russia's actions at an hour-long press conference at the Foreign Ministry yesterday afternoon, they even refused to describe what happened in Ukraine overnight as an invasion. She called for all sides to exercise restraint as sirens and explosions were being held in Kiev. Instead, she turned her ire to the United States, which she accused of fanning the flames of this conflict for providing Ukraine with military weapons. The Chinese government has blatantly accepted the Russian view that it was being left with no choice. It won't condemn, but it won't go as far as to condone, because these two allies, China is the economic powerhouse. It has the higher stakes in the global economy and can't afford to completely alienate the American and European markets. Russia has a massive global presence, but economically it is the minor player. Tom, it was just 3 weeks ago that President Putin and President Xi got round the table here in Beijing and discussed a new global order. Suddenly, the timing and the details of that meeting have taken on a new, sinister significance.
Well, Debbie, it was fascinating to have your interview with the Taiwanese foreign minister the other day. Very alarming. But for now, thank you very much indeed. Now let's come back here, and there are around 70,000 Ukrainians living in the UK. They are beyond worried tonight about what is happening to family and friends back home and indeed to their country. There is a thriving Ukrainian community in West Yorkshire. It has a fierce belief, despite the distance from the homeland of parents and grandparents, that its independence must be respected and protected.
At Leeds' Ukrainian Community Centre, people gathered tonight to feel close to each other, collecting donations and their thoughts on a day when, for many, their family feels so very far away.
Checking text messages with my family back in Ukraine. How are they? I think they're trying to keep calm. I think I'm more scared than they are. They're okay.
I called my mom straight ahead, and she told me that there was this big explosion next to her house, and everything was shaking. There were like broken cars, broken buildings. Really, my heart was just getting out my chest.
In Doncaster, Paul is taking every opportunity to stay in touch with his cousin, with no idea when they'll be able to meet in person again.
The biggest fear has got to be for if any of them were to suffer loss of life. The worry would be that it becomes a Russian border and not a Ukrainian border that we have to enter if we went to visit them. And that could well be, we could well be excluded.
Just 3 days have passed since Olga convinced her mum to get out of Ukraine. Tonight, from the safety of Manchester, they watch on in horror.
I'm not shocked, but more angry with that anger. Like, how dare they? Mom, вот спрашивают.
And then Olga asks her mum whether she's scared of President Putin.
No. No. You see? Мы его презираем. She says we despise him.
Tonight, as Ukrainians living across the UK find comfort in helping one another, what many really long to share is the safety of their home. Hannah Miller, News at 10.
Well, however horrific the events in Ukraine today have been, there may be many who feel reassured that this is, at least, not a conflict we appear likely to be drawn into, at least in the short term. But is that really the case? It is true, yes, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but two things now appear self-evident. The scale of Putin's ambition and his preferred modus operandi, which is to claim mistreatment of ethnic Russian minority communities as a pretext for invading. All of which brings us to the Baltic states. In Estonia, ethnic Russians make up about 25% of the population. They are mostly well integrated, but there were protests and then riots in 2007 when a Soviet-era statue of a soldier was removed from the centre of the capital. In neighbouring Latvia, ethnic Russians also make up roughly 25% of the population. More recently, there were protests when the Latvian language was made compulsory in schools. In Lithuania, the Russian population is smaller, but it has the complication of this Russian territory, Kaliningrad, the other side of its western border. All three are, of course, NATO members. We would be compelled to intervene if they were invaded. But if Putin again threatened or appeared to a nuclear strike, what would we do in reality? Raggy is here to talk about all this. Look, it's incredibly alarming what's going on in Ukraine. Arguably more alarming is what it might say about Putin's long-term ambitions and their impact on all of us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But we can't stay here tonight, Tom, and say that the likelihood that there will never be war between us as a NATO member and other NATO members with Russia is out of bounds. It is a very real possibility. Ukraine, as we were seeing in that map, is the last buffer between the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Eastern European countries that are now members of NATO and members of the European Union. If we don't hold the line, for want of a better phrase, in Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin sees a chink in our armour in order to move NATO further back, and he attacks a Baltic state, we will be at war with Russia. But what is important is the factor of what he will face in Ukraine. It will not be easy. Ukraine will, I think, fight and resist an onslaught. And if Vladimir Putin becomes bogged down in the way we became bogged down in Iraq, you know, he thinks he's going there to be liberators in the way that we thought we were going to be in Iraq. Look how that ended. If he faces that kind of challenge, then how can he possibly fight a war on 6 or 7 fronts. And that is the real challenge to him and what would prevent a war that involves us with Russia.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Raggy. Now, the first effects that will be felt here from the start of Russia's invasion will probably be at the petrol pumps. Already high prices have risen again, with predictions they could reach £1.55 a litre. Wholesale gas prices are up by a third, yes, a third on the day. And the value of shares on the FTSE 100 suffered its biggest daily fall since June 2020.
The trading floors of the city are more than 1,000 miles from Ukraine. But in a global economy, the tremors of war reverberate far beyond borders.
555.
Share prices falling, markets shuddering, and every one of us affected.
Clearly, we're not experiencing the kind of disruption you're seeing in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine, but you get a sense of nervousness spreading throughout the West, I think, at this point.
It comes as millions already face a cost of living crisis, and it's the pumps where we'll feel it first.
There is a lag before rising oil prices hit, but the average amount being charged for both petrol and diesel across the country is now at a record high, with the RAC warning that petrol could reach the grim milestone of £1.50 a litre in the coming days.
It's the result of world oil prices hitting more than $105 a barrel, the highest for 7 years. Wholesale gas in the UK soaring by more than 30%. Now, Russia only supplies 6% of our oil and 5% of our gas, but the prices we pay are set by the global market and go up at the pumps when supply is constricted. That hits delivery costs too, meaning higher prices for goods, pushing inflation up. For many households, that will mean even more of a struggle to pay for food and heating. We already face 2 monumental rises in energy bills when the price cap increases, first in April, then October. But today, the Chancellor claimed he'd already factored instability in.
Just recently, I announced very significant support for British families to help them with higher energy prices. And the way that we structured that support, which totals almost £9 billion, it is for it to come in 2 stages. The first help will come in April, but then there is a second part of that support that will come in October.
But businesses like this takeaway, which struggled through the pandemic, are on their own.
Literally anything we use, anything we get, any people, anything involved in our production process and in our sales process, the prices are going up.
Financial worries here do not compare to Ukraine's agony. But just as the cloud of economic hardship caused by COVID seemed to be lifting, the fog of war is plunging us into uncertain times again. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
Well, let's go back now to James in the Ukrainian capital, where events are unfolding fast. And Ukrainians, James, I guess, are extremely nervous about what they'll be waking up to.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty quiet here, but events are still developing. First of all, that battle for that airfield that you saw in my report and that Rohit was updating you on, the Ukrainians who earlier in the day had admitted the Russians controlled it now say their special forces have driven the Russians off and they are back in control. Now, one must always be sceptical of these things in wartime, but there are reasons to think that may be the case. And if so, it would be a significant blow to Russian attempts to quickly take this capital, even if ultimately it's only delaying the inevitable. The other development is that President Macron of France, despite the complete failure of his diplomatic efforts in the lead up to this, has been on the telephone to President Putin again tonight. This on a day when the Ukrainians have broken off diplomatic relations, when President Biden says he won't talk to him. Nothing much has come of it, I might add, but it is making Ukrainians wonder just how much resolve there is in the West if on a day like this President Macron will do it. What they're asking themselves is, to the West, if not now, when?
OK, James, as I said to the others, please look after yourself and speak to you soon. Thank you very much. Now, so tonight, a European capital is being gradually encircled, as James was talking about. How quickly, we just don't know. The column in the centre of Kiev's main square celebrates Ukraine's cherished independence from Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, the clouds of war hang over Ukraine's future as an independent nation, a target in President Putin's dark master plan to reimagine the old Soviet Union. Whatever hope for Ukraine there is relies perhaps on the Western sanctions against Russia actually working. Tonight, Kiev is a capital relying on the strength of Ukrainian forces to protect it from the Russian advance. This Prime Minister back here has nailed his colours to the mast. He and other Western leaders will be hoping tougher sanctions will change President Putin's mind. That looks a forlorn hope on this, a quite frankly grim and portentous night in the history of liberal democracy. That's it for tonight. Good night. Thank you for watching.